Mark Honegger is a professor of linguistics and head of the Department of English at the University of Louisiana Lafayette, where he oversees the TESOL concentration. His current research focuses on cross-cultural semantics and the impact of technique on cultural change. Looking forward to hearing the paper. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So this paper is going to be very different than Michael's paper, for better or worse. It is going to talk about connections between social capital and economic capital that Bruce, I believe, was raising. We'll talk a little bit about socialism and capitalism as well. So there's a whole bunch of things that have been introduced that are going to kind of be interwoven as far as this paper is concerned. So I'm going to have to move over here. Yeah, so the title is Money as Technique, What Happens to Our Humanity? And what I'm especially interested in this paper is technique versus the personalism of Jacques Ellul, which I believe those are the two things that I'm particularly concerned about that are at odds with each other. And I hope to show that the true cost of technique is first and foremost our human relationships and well-being. We often think about cost in terms of finances, how much we're paying for something, but I believe that we're paying for things with our very selves. And I kind of want to elucidate that in terms of the social capital that Putnam talks about and some other things as well. And so I want to start with, ironically, a quote from Woodrow Wilson that I came upon that I found very fascinating. So Woodrow Wilson, in his first campaign for the U.S. presidency in 1912, said the following: "We have come upon a very different age from any that preceded us. Yesterday and ever since history began, men were related to one another as individuals. All over the Union, people are coming to feel they have no control over the course of their affairs. Today, the everyday relationships of men are largely with great impersonal concerns, with organizations, not with other individual men. Now, this is nothing new this is nothing short of a new social age, a new era of human relationships, a new stage setting for the drama of life." He almost sounds right that he was listening to Jacques Ellul. I believe, Ellul was he born in 1912, I believe, so obviously he preceded Ellul. But this is exactly what my entire talk is about, right? I believe there's this great transfer taking place between our one-on-one relationships and relationships with large institutions. And so if you all imagine your own life for a moment, right, and you think about who you are, particularly in terms of your one-on-one relationships. So I might have a one-on-one relationship with you, and I might have a one-on-one relationship with you, and I might know you, and I might know you. And now imagine that one of those one-on-one relationships is taken away. It's really substituted now with a relationship between myself and some large institution, government, bank, company, whatever the case might be. Or imagine, and I think this is often what's taking place, that this one-on-one relationship we have is no longer direct, but it's mediated through a large institution, which is interposing itself between you and me, and is drastically reshaping ourselves and our relationships as well. This is the transfer that I'm interested in. Now, let me start with a simple comparison, a very concrete comparison to kind of give you an idea of what I'm thinking about. And as I talk about this, I want you to think about this basic question, and I hope you think about it specifically, not in the abstract or, not writ large. That's a big problem we have in modern life, and it's actually a big problem I think we have at a conference like this, because we're talking about lots of global things, right? And so we tend to talk in a lot of abstractions and a lot of global things and things writ large. And I feel that sometimes we get lost in the bigness of what we're talking about. And I always want to bring it back to very specific, and I like to bring it back to one-on-one relationships. So think about your own life and think about your relationships and think about what are the real obligations. And maybe even more importantly, what are the real vulnerabilities you have to specific individuals? So I want you to think about specific people in your life. And if I say, okay, tell me, say we were very honest, tell me about a vulnerability you have to some specific person in your life, and kind of what springs to your mind. You know, is there much there? Is there much content? You know, what kinds of things are coming into place? Now, with that in the backdrop of your mind, let me give you a specific situation of an institution imposing itself in a personal relationship. And so, before the modern era, what might someone do who needed to make a purchase without having the money to do so? Right? So, right, typical situation a long time ago, they might go to the general store in town where they knew the owner and the owner knew them, and they might ask if they could buy something with a promise to pay at a later date. And suppose the store owner agrees to this. And then what happens next? And that's what I'm especially interested in, right? Because, of course, there's a number of possible outcomes. One outcome is that the purchaser honors their promise and pays off their bill in an appropriate amount of time. And if you think about it for a moment, what an interesting thing has gone on in that one-on-one relationship. There was an obligation, there was a vulnerability, there's then the fulfillment of that, and you can see what that does for the cohesion and the solidity and the honor and respect of that relationship. And of course, that's a lot of the way that human life previously operated. Of course, another possibility is the buyer does not pay their debts. And crucially in that case, right, if I'm the buyer and you're the store owner, I have directly harmed you in some kind of serious way. And of course, there's also the possibilities of partial payments and the possibility of a full payment after a long time is made. But you can see what a major effect that has as far as our one-on-one relationship is concerned. Now we fast forward today. And of course, what happens today, and we all know what happens today, right? I use a credit card. If I don't have money to buy something, right, I use a credit card. So I walk into the same store without having the money available, and I pay for my purchase with a credit card. And so let's compare these two situations for a moment, right? And on one level, there maybe doesn't seem to be a big difference between the two, but I'd like to suggest that these lead to major social differences. What was formerly, of course, a one-on-one relationship of mutual obligation is now mediated through this large institution, a bank and a credit card company. Previously, the customer who bought on the promise of payment from the general store had a direct one-on-one personal obligation to the store owner, and he or she personally harmed the proprietor with their non-payment. But today, what happens if I don't pay my credit card company? This is the important thing, right? It doesn't harm the store owner. That's really important, right? Because if you begin to think about it, I'm going to tell you that there's a positive and a negative attached to this. It was interesting, some of the previous questions, for the previous talk, right? When you think about technique, you gain things and you lose things if you're going to be very honest about it, right? So I don't pay my credit card company, doesn't harm you whatsoever. No, the purchaser is obligated to the credit card company, and this is crucially, right? They're not obligated to any other single individual. Importantly, right, if I don't pay my credit card company, I'm not harming any person at the credit card company, right? Because of the way the whole system is put together. So let's stop for a second, right? Let's tally up a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of effects from using credit cards. And, right, there's goods and bads. Credit cards extend people's purchasing power. They've clearly added to the material comforts of classes of people, right, in previous generations who would not have had such extensive credit made available to them. They've made it easy to purchase a wide variety of products and services. They provide protection, very interested in that, right, to both sellers and buyers. So sellers are protected from non-payment, and buyers can be protected from faulty products and services. Of course, they've increased the power of the surveillance state, right? Because now we're dependent on credit card monitoring industry, right, that is following all of your financial dealings, okay? There's a lot more surveillance there. I don't think that's benign. Keeps tabs on all our financial dealings. Of course, there's new kinds of crime and fraud, right? If you've ever had spurious charges on your credit card bill as I have had, or if you've been hacked, right, as I've been hacked, we have that whole new danger out there. There is also more vigilance required. It's the headspace problem, right? One of the problems with credit cards is if you really want to stay on top of it, you have to be vigilant all the time, right? Every month checking it, reconciling, oh, what's this charge? Did I do this charge? Did my wife do this charge? And so we're gaining and losing things there altogether. Now, this credit card scenario is just a small example of how technique has absorbed the economic arena of society, just as it's absorbed all human existence. Credit card purchases are easy to do, and I think this is one of the psychologically deceptive things to us, right? We rarely think about them deeply unless they go awry. So when you walk into the store, maybe you buy something for $5 with a credit card, and you think this is nothing, and you don't realize there's this huge infrastructure behind what you're doing, right, that I feel we need to probe. What I'm trying to do in this talk is probe in terms of how it's affecting our relationships and ourselves. And so it's difficult to recognize that, and we tend to be oblivious to all the things that are at stake. Now, this is just credit cards. We could multiply this with many other ways in which institutions are interposing themselves in our personal relationships. So you can think about insurance, and here I'm really thinking about medical insurance, right? Okay. So a long time ago, I went to my doctor, and I just paid my doctor because I could afford to pay my doctor out of my pocket, maybe, okay? But now we all know this, or almost all of us, right? When we go to the doctor, we are relating to the doctor in their office through insurance, right? So the insurance is taking care of the payment. We know what a nightmare insurance can be, right? It's a very arcane, complicated system. Sometimes I've had this before. What's this bill? Why am I being charged for this? We know this, right? That doctors' treatment, right, is dependent on the way the insurance works, right? So there's this huge intervention of this big institution which is interfering in that one-on-one relationship. Obviously, you can think about major purchases, for example, purchasing a house, where you've got then the mortgage company that intervenes, you've got the title search company that intervenes, and there's a whole bunch of other things there as well. And so there's a shift taking place here in our economic sphere of our lives that I'm very, very interested in. So I want to talk a little bit about what Ellul says about money and the economy. And this goes to some of the things you were asking about earlier, I believe. One of the things that I find very intriguing about Ellul when it comes to talking about economic issues is how he subordinates, for example, this debate between capitalism and socialism to his greater concern about how technique has subsumed money. And the book in particular, he talks about this in the Technological Society, but I'm also interested here now for a moment in his book, Money and Power, if you've read that. And he says in Money and Power, with regard to pursuing a political or economic solution, such as will capitalism solve our problems, will socialism solve our problems, he argues that these kinds of collective actions based on social theory must be a secondary issue. The primary thing to understand is the spiritual reality of forces or of institutions, which is what I'm particularly focusing on in this talk. And he goes on briefly to discuss capitalism and socialism. And though his sympathies, if you've read him, you know, lie with socialism in the abstract, which he finds to be more humane, his final assessment is that the differences between these systems look small compared to their similarity, which is that they both subordinate the individual to forces beyond any one person's control. Now, in Power and Money, he goes on to describe money the same way he describes technique. So he says that money has become complex, abstract, and impersonal. So money is complex because it's based on the total economy. We're well aware that money is closely linked to all, this is his quote, closely linked to all economic phenomena, that it affects each of the others. We also know that an individual cannot earn or spend money without becoming part of the complex interplay of the larger economy. In reality, money is nothing but the symbol of the total economy. That is, with regard to capitalism, I don't think Ellul would say it's capitalism, he'd say it's technique. Capitalism has been absorbed in a particular way in which technique operates now. We can talk about that later. He says that money is abstract because one can no longer hold anything in their hands of value. Here, back then when he wrote, he was talking about paper money and coins. We can push that even farther today. And then finally it says it's become impersonal because the use of money is not an individual act. It does not signify personal control, but instead results from distant and complex interactions of which our acts are merely echoes. Now, Ellul doesn't go in, as he does in some places, he doesn't go in a lot of detail about how money has become complex, abstract, and impersonal, but I believe that we can kind of flesh it out, and I want to kind of flesh it out in this paper. Okay? So I just want to talk about a few things briefly to kind of give some flesh to what he's describing here. So with regard to being complex, let's talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve, right, which is the central banking system of the United States. It was created in 1913, and it's a good example. It's a great example of technique because it shows how one of the most, I think, important characteristics of technique is size. We are making things very big that by their size then are capable of smaller problems and smaller issues. And I always like to ask this, right? Technique is always humans trying to solve some kind of problem. What were we trying to solve back in 1913? Well, if you know anything about the history, the U.S. had been beset by a number of financial panics in its earlier history over the centuries. Some of them got, very difficult, right? Caused a lot of suffering, caused a lot of problems. And so it was solved, right, by the Federal Reserve, which was a system of central control. Its primary goals of the Federal Reserve are to increase employment and manage inflation. Those are the two stated goals. Goals that, by the way, are at odds with each other. I think that's very, very interesting. And they tell us something about how this is all operating in our economy. But, simply speaking, by setting interest rates and controlling the supply of money, it seeks to manage these goals. It's also the lender of last resort to preserve banks and financial institutions. And so when the U.S. government created the Fed, it in essence made a large government-backed system, as large as the country itself, that by its size could handle economic crises smaller than themselves. This is what happened, of course, in the 2008 subprime mortgage meltdown, right? Where the Fed saved some investment banks and let others dissolve, okay? And it's really, really interesting, right? If you remember anything about that, there was a lot of hue and cry about the ethics about what is taking place. Is it ethical to do what the government is doing? And it's very much like Ellul describes, has nothing to do with ethics. It was completely about the survival of the entire system. Now, talk a little bit more about the Fed here, right? So one of the fascinating things about the Fed, how it operates, is that, as some of you might know, current economic orthodoxy says that the U.S. economy should average an inflation rate of about 2% for optimal functioning. And money, of course, when you look at the way that they're determining these things, money is based on really not just the U.S., but it's really based on how the entire world is tied together economically. And so it aims for a certain optimal inflation rate. It can go for a higher inflation rate. I want you to tuck that in the back of your mind. And so it's doing things on the basis of how the whole entire complicated system goes together. It's too complex for any one person to understand, right? People are always guessing how to put together all these complicated quotients. But crucially here, this has a major determinant on the money in your pocket and your relationships, right? Because they're making decisions that have nothing to do with you as an individual, okay? So you want to start a business, or you want to run a business, you want to make a large purchase like a house, you're at the mercy of the Federal Reserve all the time, which is making decisions, again, for completely different criteria. We talked a little bit about money as abstract, right? Ellul was talking about paper money or coins, okay? But ironically, it's even more abstract today than it was back in his day because, again, for me, I don't know, maybe for most of you, it's basically electronic, okay? I have my, salary deposited electronically into my bank account by my employer, right? I pay most of my bills online, pay with a debit card, that's electronic, pay with a credit card, okay? Almost never am using paper currency or cash, okay? So it's become a very abstract sort of thing. Now, and this is important to think about, and this goes to talking about, capitalism versus socialism. When you begin to kind of just get a general Ellulian picture of what's going on in the economy, think it's important to think about this, right? That money today is not really a measure of value, which is kind of inherently what we think it is, right? So, you pull a dollar bill out of your pocket if you have a dollar bill. Okay, what is it worth? Okay, that is the wrong question, right? And when you put it in this whole scenario where, we had no inflation or hardly any inflation for a number of years, and economists were worried about that, right? And then we go through these periods of inflation, the Fed makes certain decisions where it devalues money because, you see, the Fed isn't really first and foremost concerned with preserving value, right? They're making decisions so that the whole system can function well. And so money is not really a measure of value. It's more like, to use a metaphor, it's more like the vital fluids of technique. It's really kind of the substance of technique which enables the whole system to work together. And then, of course, I talked about it being impersonal, talking about credit cards. For the sake of time, I won't say anything more about that. Okay, so let's put this all together for a second, right? There's a bunch of things going on in the economy which really directly relate to our one-on-one relationships because they go back to that question about vulnerabilities, right, and obligations, which you think about it often took economic forms in prior times and still take on economic things. And so our one-on-one dependency is being decreased, right? Our one-on-one vulnerability is being decreased. Do we see this reflected in society? And this is where Putnam comes in. I believe this is exactly what we see reflected in the kinds of things that Robert Putnam is talking about. And so if you've never read this book, I'd highly recommend it to you. Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, Robert Putnam. He's a social scientist at Harvard who amasses a wealth of data to talk about this idea of social capital and this tremendous decrease in social capital that's taken place particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, but it's continuing to today. Okay, so what is he talking about here, right? So he's talking about many facets of civic engagement and declining personal relationships. Now, I have to talk about this for a moment. To me, it's even very telling that we call this social capital. Basically, I guess, a financial metaphor for something, human relationships, which from an Ellul point of view, I think have their own intrinsic value. Social capital is really thinking about our relationships in terms of there's benefit for things like the economy, or there are benefits for the government as a whole, or something along those lines. And so I would even quibble with the term that we use there. But let's talk a little bit about some of the things that Putnam uncovers. He's got a wealth of things to talk about. I'm just going to highlight a few things here. So two of the most telling phenomena that Putnam talks about are the decline of informal social connections and the decline of social trust and reciprocity. The time and energy invested in friends and neighbors and extended family has decreased considerably. I think, Michael, you were talking about this morning, as a matter of fact, in your work. And so, for example, according to the DDB Needham Lifestyle Archive, the average American in the 1970s hosted friends at home 14 to 15 times per year. But by the late 1990s, that number had declined to 8 times per year, a drop of 45% in some 20 years. And this was written, of course, in the early 2000s, but these trends have continued to today. I don't have updated numbers. Work done by the Yankelovich partners shows a decline of 1/3 in the openness of Americans to start new friendships. The percentage of Americans who report usually eating dinner together declined from 50% to 34% in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. According to the General Social Survey, between 1974 and 1998, the number of evenings spent socially with a neighbor decreased for both married and unmarried Americans by about 1/3. Now, at the same time we're having these decreases in social capital, there are other things that are increasing in society. What are those? Okay. Well, one kind of group that increased at this time was neighborhood watch groups. Very, very interesting, right? But, okay, so these increased in number, but they measured this. Fewer people attended an actual neighborhood watch meeting than kept a weapon, a guard's dog, or installed extra locks in their home. That is, rather than turning to neighborhood relationships, as we did a long time ago, people sought to establish their own security, a testament again to how one-on-one relationships have been replaced with other means. It should come as no surprise that there's also a well-documented decrease in social trust and honesty in the U.S. Polls have asked Americans standard questions about this topic for many years. So, for example, in response to the question, do you think people in general today lead as good a lives, honest and moral as they used to? 50% in 1952 said yes, while only 28% said though in 1998. Now, there's a lot of questions about what this change is, but it's pretty consistent that there is a lack of social trust that's showing up in these kinds of questionnaires. At the same time that social trust was decreasing, there was a marked increase in the number of lawyers and personnel in public and private security going on at this time. So in 1995, the U.S. had 40% more police and guards and 150% more lawyers and judges than would have been forecast in 1970 based on population growth. Both civic and religious participation are down. Membership in voluntary organizations such as the Boy Scouts, American Legion, and the NAACP is down. These groups have local chapters and significant grassroots activity, and so for the first two-thirds of the 20th century, Americans became more involved in those associations. There was a general upward trend through the first two-thirds, three-fourths of the 20th century, apart from the interlude of the Great Depression. But they've been steadily declining since the late 1950s. At the same time these organizations have decreased, there's been a proliferation of mass membership organizations, typically headquartered near Washington, D.C. They do extensive fundraising and are primarily involved in advocacy work seeking to bring pressure on the government. So a good example of this is AARP. Apart from writing a check for membership dues, less than 10% of its members belong to a local chapter. The drop in religious participation is, of course, very notable. And here it's interesting to think about this for a moment. People of faith, of course, sense a spiritual crisis. But I really want to think about it now in terms of this picture because it fits this overall picture of decreasing social capital. And I think part of the decrease in religious participation, both attendance and being active in it, is related to all these other things as well. It fits this larger loss of personal relationship and these loosening bonds of community. Now, Putnam considers a lot of explanations for this dramatic shift in our culture. The pressures of time and money, mobility and sprawl, technology and mass media, generational changes related to the historical event of World War II, and it's probably a complex problem that has a number of different causes. And he clearly has a preference for causes that can be quantified. He's a social scientist, right? So he doesn't say anything about a topic like technique as Ellul elucidates it. Technique, of course, is a global totalizing phenomenon that can't be captured with a statistic or a number. But you can see what I'm trying to suggest to you, right? I'm not talking about causation here, but there's clearly a correlation for what I was describing here with our one-on-one relationships being replaced by relationships with us and a large institution, and interposing in that, and these decrease of social capital, all of these things are taking place at the same time. So I want you to think about this. We end up here in just a moment. Give me a couple seconds here. So I think one of the big things is our dependencies on our vulnerabilities and our ethics, right? All of these things are radically being reshaped by technique. Things have evolved in a way where we want to be less dependent on other people. And I think this is very American. Nobody wants to depend on anybody else. Nobody wants to be vulnerable to anybody else. We're worried for our safety. And so we are seeking some protection, and we believe the protection is going to come from the institution, right? So I don't trust you financially, but if I do it with a credit card, okay, there's my protection between you and me, and I make the relationship work. I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you.